Great. Thanks very much to Felix and Thomas for including this paper in the program. This is joint work with David Atkin and Marco Gonzalez Navarro. The paper is about the consequences of globalization in the retail sector for household welfare in developing countries, and the empirical context is going to be Mexico. The motivation behind this paper can be summarized as follows. The arrival of global retail chains in developing countries is causing a radical transformation in the way that households source their consumption. This process has led to heated policy debates, and more importantly, those debates have led to stark differences in the policy approaches across developing countries towards retail FDI. One prominent recent example for this would be the case of India, which is currently on its way back to an outright ban of foreign retailers in its domestic marketplace, which is in stark contrast to other developing countries such as Mexico, Argentina, Brazil, most of Eastern Europe, who've chosen to liberalize their retail sectors early on and fully at the beginning of the 1990s. Somewhat surprisingly, given the importance of retail for both employment as well as consumption, the existing literatures in trade and development have so far paid relatively little attention to this channel of international integration, and this is where we hope this paper can contribute. Let me give you a couple of headline figures of why we think retail globalization is an interesting subject to study. Retail is an important sector. That's especially the case in developing countries. For the average developing country, retail accounts for something like 15 to 20% of total employment, 10 to 15% of total GDP, and clearly more than 50% of overall household consumption. What these figures suggest is that any shock to the retail sector is likely going to affect household welfare through both nominal incomes as well as through household price indexes, cost of living. This sector has seen a significant wave of globalization over the past 2 decades among developing countries. One way to look at that is to look at the stock of retail FDI accounted for by developing countries. That stock increased more than 20-fold since the 1990s. And over the same period, the share of developing countries accounting for retail FDI has also more than doubled to about 1/4 in recent years. This paper is based on Mexico, a country whose retail sector has seen a dramatic transformation as foreign retailers came to dominate the domestic marketplace. And in particular, our empirical setting is going to coincide with the major wave of foreign store expansion in Mexico, a period during which the number of foreign-owned supermarkets went from something like 350 stores, close to quadrupling, to more than 1,300 stores at the end of our sample period, which is the beginning of 2014. What do we set out to do in this paper? We aim to contribute to our understanding of 3 central questions. The first question is, what is the effect of foreign retail entry for average household welfare in the municipality of entry? What are the channels underlying this effect? And number 3, what is the distribution of the gains from retail FDI across the pre-existing distribution of household incomes? In answering these questions, the paper also makes 2 methodological contributions to the literature that is focused on quantifying the gains from trade and FDI. The first contribution is that rather than imposing structure ex ante in order to limit the data requirements of the welfare analysis to a set of readily observed cross-country moments, we instead make use of newly available and uniquely rich microdata that allow us to estimate a very general expression of the welfare gains or the welfare consequences of retail FDI. What I mean by that is that rich data on barcode level consumer prices, consumption quantities, household incomes, as well as store profits allow us to empirically capture all major components of household welfare without having to restrict or shut down any potential channels, such as the gains from variety or pro-competitive effect on consumer prices in domestic stores ex ante. The second contribution is that rather than relying on cross-sectional moments that may or may not capture the causal effect of retail FDI, we instead use an event study design to assure that the moments that we feed into our welfare expression are causally identified. The event study methodology uses data on the store locations and dates of opening for the universe of foreign-owned supermarkets in Mexico, in combination with high-frequency data on local economic outcomes such as consumer prices or household nominal incomes. What this methodology allows us to do is to transparently and non-parametrically explore to what extent pre-existing trends in local economic outcomes may confound the comparison of outcomes before and after foreign entry. And once I show you the first event study graphs, I hope that will become clear. Let me tell you a little bit more about the main data sets that we use in this analysis. The paper uses 6 main microdata sets. In addition to store locations and opening dates, we use these 5 data sets on the slide here. The first one is the confidential microdata of the Mexican CPI. These data are the microdata that Mexico uses to estimate consumer price inflation among urban Mexico. These data provide us with something like 80,000 store-level price quotes, so individual items tracked every month over time. What these data allow us to do is to estimate the effect of foreign retail entry on consumer prices in the pre-existing domestic store environment. We complement these data on store prices with data on consumption quantities at the same barcode identified level. For this purpose, we use the data from a large international market research company. You can think of these data as similar to the home scanner data that is available here at Chicago booth, just in the Mexican context. So in addition to observing prices, we also observe quantities. And one important moment we're going to get from these consumer panel microdata is which household substitutes what fraction of their retail consumption into the new foreign store after that store comes to town, which will be an important moment for the price index estimation. Given that this is a developing country setting, one may think that a large fraction of household consumption is in the informal sector, as non-barcoded items at local street vendors and street markets. Fortunately, both of these data sets have been designed to capture 100% of retail consumption. So when a household goes to a local street vendor and buys a tortilla, which is non-barcoded, that is a transaction that is in our consumption weights, and in the data, it's just that in certain parts of the analysis, for example, when we want to hold quality characteristics of products constant and see how their prices change, that we only focus attention on the barcoded space. On nominal incomes for worker level outcomes, so with a focus on wages, we use the data on quarterly worker level total incomes and the shares across different occupations from the Mexican income and employment surveys. So here you observe the quarterly time series for a worker, and you observe the total outcome as well as what fraction of that income comes from, for example, working for an independent mom and pop store, working for a formal supermarket, working for a manufacturing firm. So we have all these different occupations in there. We complement these worker level data with the confidential microdata of the Mexican retail census to get moments on domestic store owners' profits as well as store exit. And then finally, you can think of this final data set here, which is the Mexican income and expenditure surveys, as a holder data set for the quantification. So for the quantification exercise, what we want to have is a data set that gives us pre-existing income shares and pre-existing expenditure shares across product groups and store types in a period before the foreign retailer comes to town, in order to apply some of these point estimates that we're getting on prices and incomes to these pre-existing shares. And that's what we're doing in the quantification, and that's what we use the uniquely rich Mexican expenditure and consumption surveys on. So what's important and special in these data is that, for example, you don't just observe what a household buys in terms of product groups, you also observe at what store format the household buys it, which is not very common. All right, using these data sets in combination with our theoretical framework, we present a number of new findings. We find that foreign retail entry causes large and significant positive effects for average household welfare in the municipality of entry. These effects are in the order of 7% of initial household income. The majority of that effect is driven by a significant reduction in household cost of living. Interestingly, a significant fraction of that total reduction in household cost of living is driven by what we label the pro-competitive effect of foreign retail entry. That is the effect of foreign retail entry on domestic consumer prices in the pre-existing domestic retail environment. The remainder and the majority of the cost of living effect is driven by what we label the direct price index effect of a foreign store. These are the consumer gains due to having the option of going shopping at that new foreign store in town. The direct price index effect captures three distinct channels through which that foreign retailer can add value to local consumers. Number one, the foreign retailer can charge cheaper prices on pre-existing product varieties, something that we will show you in the data. Number two, the foreign retailer can offer product varieties that weren't available before the foreign retailer came to town. We'll show you some statistics on that too. And number three, the foreign retailer can offer both overlapping and non-overlapping product varieties subject to different store amenities. Think of parking spaces, hygiene, security, but also store location, and some of these things work in different directions. Also, store branding might be important, right? Often when you have a foreign retailer going into a developing country, the branding perception of that retailer is radically altered. If you've ever gone to McDonald's in China, you will have witnessed that. On the nominal income side, we find no evidence of a significant effect on average municipality level outcomes in terms of household incomes or employment propensities. However, we do find adverse effects on retail wages in the domestic sector, as well as the business profits of domestic store owners and store exit. Okay, so we do find evidence for some of these things that politicians seem to worry about in public debates. And then finally, we explore the heterogeneity of this average effect across the pre-existing distribution of household incomes, and we find that while all household income groups significantly benefit on average from the foreign retailer coming to town, this effect is close to double as large for the richest households compared to the poorest households. So there's an average positive effect, but that is clearly regressive towards richer income households, and the final part of the paper explores the channels that underlie this regressiveness. All right, what's on the menu for the rest of the talk? The paper and also the analysis that I'm going to present today broadly proceeds in 4 steps. We start by writing down a general expression for the welfare effect of foreign retail entry in the municipality of entry. We then decompose that total effect into distinct channels on both the cost of living side as well as the nominal income side. And then the name of the game is to write that welfare expression purely in terms of observable moments in our microdata. And there's 3 key types of these observable moments. The first type is causal effects on consumer prices, consumption quantities, and nominal incomes. The second type is demand parameters that govern the substitutability between local retail outlets as a function of differences in prices. And the third key moment are these pre-existing income and expenditure shares that we get from the holder data set. We then put all of these moments together and proceed to the quantification, and I'll plot that across the income distribution. All right, related literature. This paper relates to a number of different strings of literature. Let me just say 2 things in the interest of brevity. Compared to the literature on globalization and development, which is a very broad literature, we do a number of things differently, but I think methodologically the one thing that we clearly do differently is we pay very careful attention and use newly available data to estimate the welfare consequences that operate through cost of living inflation rather than just nominal incomes. So rather than using a state-level price deflator or taking some broad averages of agricultural commodity price growth without adjusting for quality, we're able to capture extensive margin changes to the set of varieties available, holding product quality constant, and clearly in our setting, this rich data on the price index matters a lot. Secondly, we're not the first paper to look at foreign retailers in developing countries. There's a small existing literature that has focused on the effects that Andy was talking about, that has focused on the effects of retailers coming in along the supply chain. So these sort of spillover effects on domestic manufacturing and agriculture. What we focus on is different. We focus on the local effects of store opening events for both consumers and workers in that municipality. All right, background on retail globalization in Mexico. I'll show you the store expansion on maps, which is the easiest, and these are the names of the foreign retailers that are in our data set. By far the largest foreign retailer in Mexico is Walmart, which is called Walmart of Mexico, which operates across these different store formats, but there's a bunch of other retailers that are in the data. Walmart came in at the beginning of the 1990s. I think Safeway, which is a corporation with Casale, was the first one to come in 89. So before NAFTA, you could only own 49%, and it had to be approved on a case-by-case basis. After NAFTA, you could own however much you wanted, and it didn't have to be approved on a case-by-case basis. You could basically go in. It was fully liberalized. Yeah, so let me show you store expansion over time. So the first data point we have here is foreign-owned supermarkets across Mexico at the end of 1995. So that's 2 years after NAFTA came into effect. There were 204 stores, and they were heavily concentrated in the main metropolitan centers of Mexico. There was a very slow expansion between the mid-1990s to the beginning of the 2000s, which is the beginning of our sample period. The number went from 200 to about 350. The wave of expansion that we're capturing in our empirical analysis is what happened between 2002 and the beginning of 2014, which is a period where foreign retailers established store presence in pretty much all of urban Mexico. All right, before we go to the analysis, this is what I call motivating evidence. The question that I'm asking here is, how does a foreign retailer compare to the average domestic retailer after having come in? So ex post differences in prices, product variety, and floor space, what we can observe. And the number is, they differ drastically on a number of important dimensions. They charge on average 12% lower prices for the same barcode product in the same municipality in the same month. Okay? So that's a much larger difference than what you would get from a Walmart effect in the United States, where that price difference is usually estimated between 2 and maybe 4%. Secondly, when you replace the municipality by barcode by month fixed effect with a municipality by product group by month fixed effect, then that point estimate flips and becomes significantly positive. This suggests that within a product group, the product mix is a very different one in the foreign retailer compared to the average domestic retailer. And what we read into this number is that the foreign retailer offers significantly higher quality varieties and or larger pack sizes on average. Secondly, the last 2 columns are comparing a foreign-owned supermarket to a modern domestic supermarket. Okay, so this would be a modern supermarket format from a domestic firm. The foreign-owned supermarket offers 4 to 5 times the number of barcode variety compared to the average modern domestic store. And it's about 5 to 6 times the size in terms of floor space. Okay, so even relative to the modern sector, there's these massive differences. I will also break up those price differences into modern and domestic later on in the paper. The way that we think about the counterfactual that we are about to estimate is that a largely traditional retail environment gets exposed to what is arguably the world technological frontier of retailing. That's what these descriptive statistics motivate us to think. All right, which brings us to the theoretical framework. We start by writing down a general expression of the welfare effect of foreign retail entry, which is the compensating variation. That is the amount of money you would have to pay a household H to get to initial utility level U0H, but evaluated at the new vector of consumption prices and new nominal household income. At the broadest level, you can break up the compensating variation into an effect on the price index, cost of living, and an effect on nominal incomes. In the next slide, I'm going to break up this compensating variation into 6 distinct channels, 3 effects on cost of living and 3 distinct effects on the income side in a way that nicely corresponds to the moments that we can see in our microdata. Before I go there, let me make one more general note about how to empirically estimate this welfare expression. While on the income side, which is the traditional focus of empirical work on globalization and development, you can proceed without imposing further structure. Subject to a valid identification strategy, you can in principle just estimate what happens to household nominal incomes in a place. This is not the case for the cost of living effect. And why is that? The cost of living effect has 3 different types of price changes that are going on that all affect household welfare, only one of which you can ever hope to observe in even the richest of the microdata sets you can get your hands on. The price difference that you can hope to observe, which we do in our setting, is consumer prices in continuing domestic stores. So DC here is continuing domestic stores. We break up this consumption vector into consumer prices among continuing domestic stores that exit as a function of foreign retail entry, and the foreign retail price index. Okay? So this price effect we could in principle observe, and then we could make a first order approximation such as a Lasberre price index. We could observe that in the CPI microdata. However, the benefits of consumers due to having that new store in town with potentially different product variety that we don't observe in the first period, and also bundled with different store amenities that we also cannot price in the first period before the foreign retailer comes to town, that's something that we need to evaluate by imposing structure on consumer preferences. Okay? So these are what Jerry Hausman has called virtual price changes. It's the extensive margin changes. In our case, it's an increase in store variety when the foreign retailer comes to town, and it's a decrease in store variety if domestic stores exit, which is something that John has brought up. To evaluate the consumer effects due to these price changes, what we do is to take observed quantities, so observed changes in quantities. How much do households substitute into the new store from a 0 consumption share to something positive, and how much did they use to consume on the exiting stores? We then take those observed effects on quantities and we estimate the shape of the demand curve to then integrate under the demand function to get the virtual price effect. And that's what we do in 2 different ways in this paper, and I'm going to talk you through exactly how we do this in the next couple of slides. So after we break this up, the cost of living effect CLE and the nominal income effect, it looks like this. The cost of living effect now has these 3 terms that basically follow these 3 different price changes that I talked to you about. All we're doing here is to add and subtract different terms to break this up. The direct price index effect, think of it as estimating the price change that you would need to have at the new foreign store to set demand equal to 0, holding all other prices constant. Right? That's the direct price index effect, which is the total consumer welfare added due to having that store in town. Again, that effect bundles 3 different channels together. It's cheaper prices on pre-existing products, it's new product variety, and it's different store amenities. And these different store amenities can be negative or positive. Right? It can be a good thing to shop at a Western brand, can be a bad thing to have to drive there, and that may differ across households. This is the effect we can estimate pretty much directly off the data, which is the effect of prices that we observed before and after. And this is the pro-competitive exit effect, which is the bad thing for your price index if stores close that you previously used to value. On the nominal income side, we break up the total effect into a retail labor income effect that we let to be differentiated by I. I here is whether or not you work in the traditional store environment, which is street markets, street vendors, mom and pop stores, or the modern retail environment, which is formal supermarkets where you have a social security package and all that. A retail business effect, which is the effect on the business incomes of domestic store owners, and other general equilibrium effects, which would include manufacturing workers, agricultural workers, and so forth. The name of the game is to write this general expression, which is in terms of expenditure functions, price vectors, utilities, and incomes floating around, in terms of observable moments in the data. 4 of these, we could just directly go to the data and estimate them, which is the income effects, and this price effect. For these potentially important extensive margin changes to store variety, we have to impose structure on household preferences, which we do in two different ways in this paper. Okay? The first way is an exact and complete estimation of the welfare gains from having that new store variety in town following the trade literature. And what we do here is to impose CES preferences across local retail outlets on the consumption side. The advantages of that are number one, and I will show you this on the next slide, that we can directly relate our welfare estimates to the existing trade literature on the gains from variety. And number two, that the CES approach is consistent with having individual households making discrete choices across local stores to shop in, but aggregating up to the income group level that gives rise to the CES structure following the results in Anders and De Palma and Thies. While this approach has its advantages, it clearly has a very clear set of disadvantages, which is that we impose very strong structure on how households choose their stores locally and source their consumption. So what we also wanted to do is to take a data-driven approach that only exploits the richness of the data that we have. So we have sort of these two different opposites that we estimate these extensive margin changes of. What we do in the second approach is to say, let's just take observed differences in store prices, and let's forget about gains from store variety, store amenities, and product variety. Let's just see how much more competitive the foreign retailer is compared to the store environment that used to be in place. There's two types of price differences that we want to observe for this first order, which is a partial price index of the consumer gains from that foreign store. The first one is these ex-post differences. After the store comes to town, how much cheaper is it to shop there? That's this 12% average figure I've shown you. We're going to break this up across different store formats and product groups. The second price effect that you would want to know is, well, if the previous scenario was domestic stores, and domestic stores have already responded on their prices when I take that ex-post price difference, you also want to take into account any pro-competitive effects. So these are the two price differences that go into this more data-driven approach. The benefit of doing both of these approaches is the way to think about the second approach is to give you the following answer. We're getting the exact and complete price index effect under the CES structure following Feenstra 1994 and others. And that is bundling these price effects, the variety effects, and the store amenity effects. What the second approach is doing is to give us an approximation of the part of this total effect that can only be accounted for by price differences, abstracting from gains from store variety and product variety. That's what we're doing conceptually. All right, in the CES case, in the exact and complete case, this is the preference structure that we impose. The upper tier is Cobb-Douglas across product groups G, and households may differ across the income distribution. We have 6 or 7 different income groups in the data. In their Cobb-Douglas shares across different product groups. Within a product group, they choose under asymmetric CES preferences across local retail outlets how much to source their consumption from. There's two important parameters. One is this eta parameter, which is the elasticity of substitution, subject to which households substitute between local stores as a function of price differences. And there's the asymmetric part of these CES preferences, and this is where this taste shifter comes in. So having the same shopping opportunities facing the same prices, local households across the income distribution can make very different choices on where to source their consumption from. And that will drive the direct gains from this foreign store in town. So the reason we chose CES, I told you, is to stay close to the trade literature. I can go one step further. What I mean by that is not just that we use the apparatus. We can show that once we impose CES on this key middle tier across stores, it turns out that our expression for the direct price index effect collapses to the well-known import share sufficient statistic in ACR, which was extended by Andres and Natalia Raimondo in their JPE paper to the case of horizontal FDI, right? So knowing how much of the consumption goes onto the foreign producer in our setting gives you the direct consumer gain. If we had taken an off-the-shelf quantitative model of horizontal FDI, that would have given you the total welfare expression, which provides a nice and transparent way to relate our 6 welfare terms that we have to this 1 welfare term you would have gotten if you had taken that off the shelf. So after we've imposed, so remember, what we wanted to do is to write this general expression and decomposition in terms of observable moments. I've told you I can write all of that directly as observable moments, but for these I have to impose structure. Now I've imposed 2 different structures and also preferences, and I can show you how this expression looks like when we write it in terms of observable moments in the data. This is what you get under the exact and complete approach with the CES preferences. This is the proportional change, so the compensating variation relative to how well you were from the beginning. There's 3 different types of moments. The blue moments are causal effects on consumer prices in domestic stores, consumption quantities at the foreign store after entry, consumption quantities at the exiting stores before exit, and then 3 different effects on household incomes, which is just breaking down the total household income effect into these different components. Okay? There's this demand parameter floating around, which is the elasticity of substituting between local stores. And then there's initial raw moments from the microdata. What is this? These are initial income shares from different occupations and initial expenditure shares on different product groups and different store types within those product groups. This red moment, so basically this is the exact approach that we're estimating with the CES. What happens when I slap on the first order approximation? 2 things that happen. The red moments drop out. It's no longer dependent on functional forms on the demand side. And the pro-competitive exit effect drops out because it's a partial price index with observed exposed shares. The rest of the moments stay virtually unchanged, which is the effects on nominal incomes. The pro-competitive effect is virtually unchanged. What changes is the direct effect. This direct effect is now simply the weighted average price difference that the foreign store brought to town. If we assume that the foreign store was basically priced as the average domestic store in the first period, which means that that store was existent, it had exactly the same product variety, we're taking out those gains, and the only thing that we change in this counterfactual is that that foreign store changes its prices from the initial average domestic retail prices to the prices we observe afterwards. And that's these 2 price changes, right? There's the price change, the exposed 12% difference that I've shown you, and whatever effect the foreign retailer has already brought into the domestic retailers when I take that 12% figure, so the pro-competitive effect. All right, so the aim, I'm not going to talk about the data anymore. The empirical analysis now goes in order. We estimate the blue moments first, which is effects on consumer prices, consumption quantities, and incomes. We then estimate the elasticity of substitution across local retailers using the consumer panel microdata, and then we pair the blue and the red with the black moments in the whole data set and proceed with the welfare quantification with these expressions that I've shown you. All right, we're going to start with estimating the effects of foreign retail entry on consumer prices in the pre-existing domestic retail environment. So the aim here is to estimate the effects before and after, so local consumer prices before and after the foreign retailer comes to town. I want that causal treatment effect for the local consumption basket in the domestic store environment. Okay, so this is what we label the pro-competitive effect on the intensive margin. However, as John just previewed, the obvious identification concern here is that foreign retailers don't, in principle, randomly locate or randomly choose the time of opening, right? You can be in 3 different scenarios here. The first scenario is that foreign retailers cherry pick locations with higher pre-existing consumer price growth. Okay? So they want to be in locations that have higher pre-existing growth rates and consumer prices to be in a market where that price growth goes on. In a plot of the levels of prices over time, that would be a pre-existing positive trend. If you then just compare prices before and after, you would wrongly assign a positive treatment effect on local retail prices due to the foreign retailer coming to town. That was the scenario that I started out worrying about when we first discussed this paper. Conversely, you may be in a scenario where foreign retailers pick fast-growing urban municipalities that also have seen a lot of entry among domestic retailers. So these are increasingly competitive local retail environments, and actually rather than having a pre-existing positive trend in prices, they have a pre-existing negative trend, right? So they had pre-existing lower growth rates of retail prices, and if you just compare prices before and after, you would wrongly assign a negative effect on local consumer prices due to this. Thirdly, we may be in a scenario that could be consistent with the maps that I've shown you, that in our urban estimation sample, the CPI microdata is only urban locations. And over the period of our study, which is this rapid expansion wave, foreign retailers operated under the objective to rapidly extend their store presence in pretty much all of urban Mexico. In that scenario, the date of opening would not be driven by local economic conditions and leads in economic changes, but could be actually a flat pre-existing trend. To explore in which of these scenarios we are, we use the event study design. Okay? So we use the event study design to basically estimate, rather than just one pre and post treatment effect, we will estimate 48 of those. 12 in the 12 months before the foreign entry event, and 36 afterwards. And let me talk you through. This is the log price of barcode item B in store S, in product group G, municipality M, and in month T. We regress that on a store by barcode fixed effect, okay? So each individual item becomes its own time series in a shelf, and a month fixed effect. This is the baseline event study. We will alter this afterwards. And these are the 48 treatment indicators, 12 before and 36 after, and this is a fully balanced sample of municipalities, okay? So moving forward or backwards in this event study is not a selection effect due to different municipalities experiencing these things differently over time. Okay? I'm going to show you this basic plot, and then I'm going to talk you through what we do in addition to that.
So if you have some barcodes that exist only before, and then some other barcodes that exist only after, but you look at this balanced set of municipalities, you could run these regressions, but then you would have a weird... For this regression to work, you just need one barcode in one municipality to appear twice, so that then you can have this fixed effect.
Correct.
But it could be that it's a totally disjoint set with some that are only before, some only after. So how...
It could be, so empirically it's not a totally disjoint set. It could be a totally disjoint set. You would still not estimate it of the level differences, right? So you used to have... It's the change, right? It's the growth rate of these products before and after, right? So you always... It's not like you used to have more expensive products, now you have cheaper products, right? It's you used to have products with a growth rate of X, and now you have products with a growth rate of X1, right? So you like that heterogeneity needs always to be on the growth rate of these individual products and an individual shelf that is tracked over time. That's true. Yes.
So I wonder if you can clarify a point of confusion here for me. And that is, I'm thinking of a product group as a superset of barcodes. Am I thinking about that correctly?
Mm-hmm.
And so the problem with aggregating, in your case, the problem with aggregating at the product group level, which would deal with some of these problems about the emergence of barcodes, would just is what? It just, you would miss the heterogeneity, the additional variety you mentioned.
Correct. So in terms of aggregating, the nice thing in using the raw CPI microdata is the following. The sampling design, both in the United States as well as what Mexico copied, is to have a simple average across these barcodes that they sample from within a product group is supposed to give you nationally representative consumption weights. So they sample these products across stores and barcodes within these product groups in a way that is supposed to represent the nationally representative urban consumption basket, which means that the unweighted regression, that point estimate that I would like to show you on this graph, gives you a partial price index that you would get just from foreign entry without taking into account anything else, right? So the fact that this average price decline across these retail product groups is about 3 percentage points 3 years out and longer, right? Given that these weights are supposed to represent this consumption basket, that is what you would get if you took pre-existing weights and you just took a partial price index of local retail consumption, right? So that's the nice thing in using the CPI microdata. So let me briefly talk you through this graph, and I'll show you a bunch of these, okay? So everything here is relative to 6 months before entry, and then we plotted 12 months and then 36 months out. The last month here is 36 months or longer, right? A bunch of things you notice. So there doesn't seem to be a significant pre-existing trend in prices, so no differences in price growth before. There's a slight but discontinuous jump directly after entry, then it declines for about 2 years, and then it stabilizes at around 3% afterwards. It doesn't seem to be going up, okay? So what are we doing to address some of the concerns that you may have, okay? So there's two main things. The first thing is we're worried about that some of this may be driven by more granular trends. Right now we're just taking about 141-month fixed effect. So we're just controlling for average price growth across all of these barcodes, across all of these store types. So we replaced this guy with 35,000 store type by product group by month fixed effects rather than 141, and the graph that we're getting is this one. Okay, so it looks very similar. The point estimate goes from minus 3 percentage points to -4. And again, you find the missing pre-existing trend. The second thing we do is we were worried that maybe these 12 months pre, while they buy us a balanced municipality sample, maybe it just looks like this if you extend this further. Okay. So what we also do, in addition to putting in controls, is we extended the event study to 2 years before entry, and it basically looks robust. There's no, what you wouldn't want to see is that it goes like this. And that's the basic event study. In the paper, we do a bunch of additional things. Let me just mention one thing we do. So the CPI data doesn't just have retail store price quotes. They have price quotes for local apartments, nurse visits, taxi rides, bus rides, haircuts, doctor visits, education, what have you. So we take the non-retail price index And depending on what you think a foreign retail entry does to a municipality, you can either think of that as a placebo test, that you wouldn't want to find effects, or you can think of that as an important input into our quantification if you do expect such prices. So in the paper we show this is precisely basically a 0 for all non-retail prices. So it's not like some local shock happens and the foreign retailer picked that local shock exactly at the same time, because we would have expected other prices to change as well. All right, so I'm going to finish. So this is all prices, right? So this is retail prices. So we also do the heterogeneity. We take out like this 2-year adjustment period and we just tell you how these final point estimates here differ across product groups and store types, which we feed into the quantification. It's strong. It's the same between food and non-food, and it's stronger for modern domestic stores compared to traditional domestic stores, which might tell you about the competition intensity between different store formats. The last moment I'm going to show you on prices is what we're going to need for the first order approximation of our direct price index effect. And that is these ex-post price differences. So how competitive are retailers purely in terms of prices compared to the local retail environment. This 12% figure I've shown you before, right? So prices are 12% higher on average for the average domestic outlet. That differs substantially. So it's slightly less competitive for food and beverage product groups compared to non-food product groups. And it's much higher so traditional stores are about 17% more expensive for a given barcode than the foreign retailer, and modern domestic stores about 4% compared to the foreign retailer, and then we do the full cross. And this is what we're going to use for the first order price effect. I'm going to move from prices to quantities now, okay? This is probably the most important effect on quantities, and that's what we get from the home scanner data in Mexico. This is the share of your total retail expenditure that you substitute into the new foreign store 2 years after that store is in town, right? So there's two things to notice. The average household expenditure share on that one foreign store, the median entry event is one store, so the median number of foreign stores is just one, is 30%, okay? So the average household in that municipality substitutes 30% of total retail consumption into that foreign store, which was definitely much larger than what we had expected. And the second thing to notice is the strong heterogeneity across the income distribution. So the richest households substitute more than 50% of their retail consumption expenditure into that new foreign store, and the poorest only around 10%. Now this is where the betas come in, right? They face the same store choices, the same prices, right? They live in the same place, but they choose to allocate their budget shares very differently across stores. That, in our preference structure, loads on the betas. Right? So these are different evaluations of the same store characteristics. It could be that richer income households attach more value to the particular product varieties that are sold at the new store. It could be that they have cars and attach more value to the particular shopping amenities at that store. It could be that they attach more value to the brand of a foreign retailer compared to the poorer income households. All of these stories load on the beta, which is basically saying that rich and poor may be very differently affected, may attach very different benefit from having that shopping choice in town. All right, I can also do this by product groups. It's slightly higher on average for non-food product groups compared to food product groups. And this is the final moment on quantities, okay? So the last thing we want to know is that when the foreign retailer comes to town, right, for the negative part of the store variety effect, the fact that domestic retailers may go out of town, we want to get a point estimate of how many local stores close, okay? So here we don't have high frequency data on the number of stores locally. What we have is the confidential microdata from the retail census in 2003 and 2008, right? So in terms of identification, there's so much we can do. Here's what we do. Our identifying assumption here is to say, look, in the event studies, let's say we've seen that foreign retailers expanded over all of urban Mexico rapidly over this period without paying particular attention to local economic conditions, okay? So what we're identifying this beta 1 of, which is the effect on the number of domestic stores, independent stores, as well as modern chain stores, is to compare urban municipalities that got a foreign retailer between 2004 and 2008 and municipalities that got it after 2008. So you see in terms of time window, that's much less neat, right, than doing this monthly, but that's what we do. What do we do to sort of test the robustness of these results, if that's a reasonable thing to do? We throw in a bunch of obvious controls and see how this point estimate changes across these controls. So this point estimate is marginally statistically significant, and it doesn't change a bit once we throw in obvious controls such as contemporary changes in GDP per capita, local public expenditures, once we condition up pre-existing municipality size, size bins or geographical region bins. So that gives us some confidence that these point estimates are not crazy to use for the quantification. What you would get here is that traditional stores there's a 5% decrease in the number of traditional retailers and a not statistically significant minus 0.03%. One thing methodologically for the quantification here, it's not that we select on point estimates for the quantification that have a star or don't. We use all these point estimates and we simply bootstrap using the standard errors, so the precision of each of these, right? So this one is fully in our quantification. It's just that when we bootstrap, we take into account that it's imprecisely estimated or less precisely estimated than this guy. Okay. All right, that concludes the quantities. So prices, quantities, now come nominal incomes. On the nominal income side, we take the quarterly worker level data and we try to replicate exactly the same event study, not at the monthly level as for the prices, but at the quarterly level. Okay? So these are quarterly worker nominal incomes, and these are quarterly employment propensities. And what we find in the graphs and the regressions is that on average you do not find either a break in trends or a discontinuous jump after the foreign retailer comes to town. It doesn't matter how you break it up into windows. You can just take the average effect. There's no effect on, or not a precisely estimated enough effect on average municipality level incomes or employment shares. However, what we do is to drill into the heterogeneity of those results, and here we can't do an event study just because it becomes too sparse. So what we do here is to take out an adjustment period of 2 years, and then we see how different income groups are affected differently. So here we have a municipality by quarter fixed effect. We have an occupation group by municipality fixed effect, and an occupation group by quarter fixed effect, right? So everything here is relative to other outcomes in your municipality. And the control group here are people like nurses, taxi drivers, doctors, teachers, right? So people that we here assume are not affected by foreign retail. And what you do see when you do this approach is that we find negative point estimates, partially significant, in the retail sector, and we find close to zero and insignificant estimates on manufacturing wages and agricultural wages, and we find nothing on employment propensities. Okay? So for the quantification, we will use these point estimates here, which is the differential effect of having a foreign retailer after 2 years across these different groups. All right, the final piece of the blue moments before we move on to the demand parameter estimation is what happens to store profits. Okay, so store profits, again, we get it from the retail census data, and we use exactly the same identification strategy that we used before. We have 2 cross sections of all the stores in Mexico, so 2003 and 2008, and we compare the growth in store profits among urban municipalities that have gotten the foreign retailer between 2004 and 2008 and after 2008. And again, we throw in a bunch of obvious controls and see how the point estimate of that changes. And what we find here is about a 5% decrease in the store profits of domestic store owners after the foreign retailer comes to town, which is, again, what we're going to use for the quantification on that part of the nominal income effect. All right, what I've shown you is the estimation of these 6 blue moments, effects on prices, quantities, and incomes that we're going to use for the quantification. Now we're going to estimate the eta parameter, which is the elasticity of substitution across local retail outlets in the consumer panel data. Okay? The first thing to notice is what happens when we get a large eta, what happens when we get a small eta. I've shown you that on average, households substitute 30% of their retail expenditure into the new foreign store after it came to town. If we now estimate in the data that households are not very price sensitive across local stores as a function of price differences, we're going to get a massive welfare gain, right? Because we see 30% substitution, and I show you that in the data, the way that households usually, the way that I observe it, them doing it, they're not very price sensitive, right? That would be a massive implied relative price change, and I would get a huge direct price index effect, right? So what we want to do is to estimate an eta that is arguably on the conservative side. We want to get a high eta, which means what we don't want to identify the eta on is small temporary changes in relative prices across stores, right? And then seeing how a household switches, which may be the most credible identification strategy, but you're also going to get a very low eta. So what we want to do is to identify the eta across relative store prices in the cross-section of municipalities. So the logic here is that retailers may be differently priced and productive on average, right? So a foreign retailer may always be very competitive, but he happens to be slightly more or less competitive in carbonated drinks in one municipality compared to a different municipality. Okay? So that's the variation that we want to exploit when this is our estimation equation, which is basically coming from the CES. Okay? This is the CES price index, which is a product group by household income group by municipality by quarter fixed effect in our specification. That's this guy here. And then to control for these contemporaneous taste shocks, what we put in is a retailer by quarter fixed effect, right? So the retailer by quarter fixed effect is supposed to get rid of the fact that a retailer may have an advertisement campaign and then everybody goes to the retailer, not because of prices, but because of that, okay? And what we're estimating this off, it's not average price differences between retailers or municipalities. It's literally you happen to be slightly more competitive in carbonated drinks in one municipality compared to the other municipality, and we want to observe how consumption shares across households change in these municipalities. You can still have endogeneity concerns in this, even using this variation, and the way that we address these endogeneity concerns, the simultaneity bias in demand estimation, is to follow the work of Jerry Hausman and many others, and to make the assumption that taste shocks are idiosyncratic, whereas supply shocks are correlated across these regions, which means that you can use neighboring relative store prices in a given product group and use that as an instrument for store prices that you observe in the municipality where people make choices. Okay?
Well, that's pretty strong assumption, right? And the reason it has been assumptions precise so much is that you've had demand shocks from advertising campaigns, which that's going to violate that.
If you have a better instrument for prices, then right, right, yeah. So actually, right now we're running this with a bunch of different instrumental variable candidates. The one thing that we thought may end up working neatly is that some retail chains price nationally, right? They really price nationally, right? That's what comes out of Eric Hurst's work, also for the United States, and to exploit that. So it seems to work. Gives the same beta, gives the same sigma. So the sigma that we're getting, and that I'm going to use in the graphs that I'm showing you in the last 10 minutes of this talk, is this point estimate in the estimation equation, which implies an elasticity of substitution of 3.8, right? Which you can think about how you want. It's nicely in the middle of the range of what has been estimated in very different settings in the trade literature, and also in consumption settings. If you look at the work of Jesse Hanbury and more recently Steve Redding and David Weinstein and Hotman, that's the parameter that we're going to use for our welfare quantification. And the simple side note here is it literally is the highest possible beta we could find. Sorry, not beta, but highest possible sigma that we can find using the Hausman approach. All right, so now we have the blue moments, the red moments. We pair that with the microdata on consumption expenditures and household incomes in a period before the foreign retailer comes to town. In microdata between 2006 and 2012, which is about 12,000 households. And what we're getting, this is the table of the average effects. The average welfare gain across these 12,000 households is 7.5%. The vast majority of that is driven by a reduction in cost of living. The fact that you're seeing a positive wage effect here comes from these positive point estimates, very slight positive point estimates on manufacturing and agriculture, because these standard errors here have not been adjusted to bootstrap the whole procedure. Okay, so we have not done that. I have not, literally right now, I'm treating each point estimate as a data point. So these guys here would be data point, right? It's a 1.17% increase in agricultural wages and a 2% increase in manufacturing wages. Now, manufacturing wages make up a lot of the local population, which is why you're getting an average wage effect. Once we bootstrap around these, that will no longer be statistically significant. The bootstrapping just takes several weeks, which is why we want to run it after everything's in order. Okay. So how much of this whopping direct price index effect? So the new store comes to town, and the direct consumer benefit from that new shopping opportunity in town is on average a 6% increase in welfare. That's a large effect, and that basically comes from this average 30% substitution of your retail consumption into that store, paired with the elasticity of substitution that we've estimated. Okay, how much of this, if you really don't believe in CES preferences across local retailers, how much of this can we account for just purely on the basis of observed prices doing a partial price index? The answer is 1/3. So 1/3 of this effect can be accounted for just purely based on price comparisons that you observe in the data after the foreign retailer comes to town, together with the pro-competitive effect that you're getting here. Okay. Now, how does this look across the income distribution? We have this for 12,000 households. We know their initial income shares. We know their initial consumption shares. We can apply these estimates. And what you're getting across the Mexican income distribution is, on average, strongly positive and significant effects, but close to twice as large for the richest income households compared to the poorest income households. And in the very final part of the paper, what we're doing is to drill into what sources of heterogeneity on both the income side as well as the consumption side account for this regressiveness. Why does it look to be much better for richer income households? And that's what we do. This is the decomposition, but this is the decomposition of the different channels. So that's the blue curve that I showed you before. This is the direct price index effect, and you basically see that it perfectly follows the overall effect, and all the other ones are actually not heterogeneous across income groups, and they're just basically level effects, right? So the two really important ones are the pro-competitive effect and the direct price index effect, and the heterogeneity really here is accounted for by this direct effect. What does that mean? Okay, that means that the pro-competitive effect is actually not strongly heterogeneous across, for example, food and non-food product groups, or strongly heterogeneous across retail shopping formats that rich and poor people have very different patterns for, right? Conversely, this direct price index effect basically resembles this 10% substitution by the poor and the 50% substitution by the rich. And we're doing a couple of counterfactuals to really put our finger on what is driving the regressiveness, and there's two key forces at play here. One source of consumption heterogeneity that actually pushes this, our estimated welfare gains to be much more regressive than what we're actually estimating. And that is the fact that poor income households source up to 70% of their total consumption from the retail sector. Richer income households only 30%. All the price index effects that I've showed you and all of these welfare graphs scale to total consumption, right? So we're not making the claim that this price index effect applies to your apartment costs, right? We're taking into account that the average consumption expenditure on retail is 50%, okay? So if you had set this moment in the data, this is the raw moment in the data, and this is a counterfactual graph, okay? If you had set this moment in the data to the sample average across all households, the gains from Retail FDI would have been way more regressive than what we're actually estimating. What we're estimating is this blue curve here. This is the counterfactual distribution of the gains, okay? So this moment in the data, the fact that poorer income households source way more of their total consumption from the retail sector, works big time in their favor, right? What works against them in terms of our welfare estimation is this moment here. It's the fact that they substitute very differently into that new foreign store, which loads on the beta in our preference framework, right? And literally everything, all of our heterogeneity can be explained by these different evaluations of the store, and car ownership rates and stories like that are the prime candidates, okay? Somewhat surprisingly, it's not heterogeneity on the nominal income side, right? So there are significant differences in the share of your total household income sourced from store profits, sourced from traditional retail wages, sourced from modern retail wages. But these effects just wash out at the level of an average income group. Just because for each of these groups, it's about 5% of total households who source their incomes 100% from them. And across the income and across the income distribution, if you take average effects, that just levels out. Okay? So let me come to a conclusion. I think I'm slightly ahead of time, which is always good. What we try to do in this paper is to contribute to understanding of the welfare consequences of retail globalization in developing countries. We do so by bringing to bear newly available and rich microdata to estimate a general expression of the welfare effects. The main findings are that the gains from Retail FDI are large and significant for the average household, that most of that effect is actually not driven by what most of the public debates are about, but it's actually driven by the cost of living side, by price index effects in households. And these gains are positive for all income groups, but they're significantly regressive. So richer groups gain close to twice as much. And the policy lesson that we're happy to put our fingers on right now is that given these results, maybe it is the case that public discussions focus slightly too little attention on the potential consumer welfare gains for the entirety of local consumers, rather than focusing on the potential for adverse effects on an important but nevertheless select group of households who source all of their income from the retail sector, from the traditional retail sector. Thanks for your comments and time. Yes?
You mentioned that one possible cause of this regressivity is the transportation costs and the location, but is that actually a kind of amenity. That is it the case that high-income people want to go to a store that the poorest people can't get to, and therefore it's not accidental that they're in a location that are not accessible?
It's an interesting thought. I wouldn't know an answer to that. But what I do know is if that was in operation, we would simply soak that up into the beta and estimate the net welfare consequences from segregation, basically. I don't know if that's what explains it, but yeah, that would be in there.
I mean, just as a policy thing, I mean, everybody gains here, right? It's just that some people gain more than others.
So it's not that everybody gains, right? Across income groups, on average, the effect is positive. But when I show you this table, there are households who lose, right? And actually, in our quantification, there are households who lose significantly, right? This is close to 100% of your existence that you're losing. What is this guy? This is a guy who gets hit with a 5% store exit, who loses 100% of his business income.
1.6% of the population.
Exactly right. Exactly right. So on average, across all income groups, people gain.
You could, at some level, the planner could it would be pretty
absolutely
compensate for the benefit. But just now a question on prices. To what extent do prices take into account discounts and coupons and all of that?
It's all in there. It's all in there. So it's the effective price paid in both of the data sets, in the consumer panel as well as in the store price quotes.
Do you have a plot of the betas across household groups?
I don't have a plot of the betas, no. But the plot of the betas would be one-to-one that plot of the exposed budget shares, right? It's literally that. If you make the assumption that they all face the same prices, right? You literally estimate the demand shifters.
Can you split the 7 groups into folks who live, within a kilometer of the store and those who live farther away? Because the potential gains for the poor guys who live close by could be quite high if it's really a car store.
That's true. Yeah, so I'm careful in over-promising exactly.
Selection, I want to be away from the poor people, but it would at least let you.
So for a very small sample, I think we actually have the addresses where they live. Yeah, definitely. So that would be a very interesting source of heterogeneity, right? Not just breaking it up by income groups, but who lives where, and then see benefits as a function of distance to the store.
I mean, the anecdotes in urban U.S. is that if you can get to the store, you get the benefit, but you couldn't carry very much back home.
All right. I think it's lunchtime. Thanks.